Good afternoon and welcome. Welcome to the African American Heritage House and welcome to the 2021 CHQ Assembly. My name is Errol Davis and I have the distinct honor and privilege of serving as the chairman of the board of the African American Heritage House here at Chautauqua, or AAHH as we fondly refer to it. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the first of 10 lectures that the AAHH will sponsor or co-sponsor this season. We are a diverse support organization which is informed by the African American experience. We are committed to strengthening Chautauqua, and we do this in a variety of ways, by encouraging and certainly welcoming diversity, by fostering honest conversations such as the Mirror Project, and by adding robust new voices to the programmatic mix. Today, as we are all beginning to understand, it is important that we own both our past as well as our present. We in the AAHH are committed to telling the stories that need to be told, primarily from the perspective of historically marginalized people. I encourage all of our viewers to visit our website, which you see on the screen, aaheritagehouse.org. There you will learn how to become involved in our work. We are entirely supported by contributions, and so I want to thank our many friends and supporters for making both last season and this season possible. Without the generosity of our friends and supporters, we would be unable to bring the quality speakers to Chautauqua that we have over the years and are doing so again this season. From the bottom of my heart, thank you for supporting this work. This week's thematic focus at Chautauqua is on China, and our speaker today is Paula Williams Madison, Chairman and CEO of Madison Media Management, LLC, and 88 Madison Media Works Inc. Ms. Madison is the author and executive producer, respectively, of the book and documentary Finding Samuel Lowe, which tell of her successful search to locate her Chinese grandfather's descendants in modern-day China. Named one of the 75 most powerful African Americans in corporate America by Black Enterprise magazine in 2005, and included in the Hollywood Reporter's Power 100, she's been honored by Asian organizations as well, having been recognized in 2014 as one of the outstanding 50 Asian Americans in business. And in 2015, she was honored by the East-West Players and ARP with their Visionary Award, and by the Chinese American Museum in Los Angeles with the History Maker Award. She is a dual citizen of both the U.S. and Jamaica. She serves on the boards of the Black Filmmaker Foundation, the Chinese American Museum of Los Angeles, the Center for Asian American Media, the advisory board of the Advanced Journalism Studies School of Global Journalism and Communication at Morgan State University, and many more. I am honored that she has agreed to share her thoughts with us here today, and I know that you're going to find her remarks both enjoyable and certainly insightful. However, before we begin today's lecture, our live audience should know that you may submit questions for our live Q&A with Ms. Madison through the submission portal at, again on the screen, questions.chq.org. And you can do this from any mobile or desktop browser. Or if you use Twitter, use the hashtag CHQ2021. Today's remarks were pre-recorded. However, they will be followed by a live Q&A with Paula Madison, with questions submitted by our live audience tuning in all around the world. My fellow Chautauquans, the AAHH is pleased to present to you Paula Madison.
So my name is Paula Madison. My Hakka Chinese name is Lo Xiaona, meaning that my family's surname is Lo. In China, it's Luo. Here in the West, it's Lowe. It's also Lo, Loh, Law. For those of us who are familiar with this, there is a Chinese character that's our last name. And depending upon where in the world, where in the Western world you are, and how it's translated to what's called pinyin, using Western alphabet, that's how some of us in the same family have the same surname, but spelled differently. depending upon whether you went to Singapore, whether you went to United States or the UK. So that's how and why. And then you'll see what the simplified character for my surname is. I am the granddaughter of a Chinese merchant who departed Hong Kong in 1905 at the age of 15. He went to Jamaica because at that time, Jamaica and many of the Western territories and islands were still coming out of the aftermath of the work product of enslaved Africans. And so what did happen is when the Western powers ended slavery, you had a number of industries that required free labor in order to be financially successful. So what we did see was once the enslaved Africans were emancipated, these nations turned to two other nations in the world primarily for close to free labor, very cheap labor. They went to China and they went to India. And by the time my grandfather left China to go to Jamaica, at that point, he was not going to work on a plantation as many of his predecessors were, but he was really going to work in a mercantile, in a store. All right, so that's kind of how I'm setting up how and why I, as an African American, as a Jamaican American, end up also being Chinese American, because there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of us in the world who are mixed race. And by today's vernacular, there's a new word coined, which is Blasian, Black Asians. I'm a Blasian. Naomi Osaka is a Blasian. Tiger Woods, Blasian, you get the picture. Now, from that perspective, what I want to do is just give a little background as to my family's history. My family has a documented lineage in China that goes to the year 1006 BC. So I am the 151st generation of the Luo clan of Shenzhen, China. And I say Shenzhen because Shenzhen today is a city of 30 million that 25, 30 years ago was the proverbial sleepy fishing village. And what happened was my ancestral village, which is Lo Sui Hap, was similarly sized to Shenzhen. Maybe 35 years ago, Deng Xiaoping, he decided that what should happen in China is China should come out of a mostly communist economy. And to the extent that you can insert capitalism into communism, Deng Xiaoping thought this would make sense. Deng Xiaoping and I come from the same cultural minority group in China. We are known as Hakka, H-A-K-K-A. The Hakka people are not a racial group because more than 95% of the Chinese people fall into the Han group, H-A-N. So my family is Han. I become mixed race when my grandfather departs China for Jamaica and falls in love with what makes perfectly good sense to me, beautiful Jamaican women. Because my grandfather had 2 sets of children by 2 African Jamaican women. And this happened as he reached his maturity. As I said, he arrived in Jamaica 1905 at the age of 15. Unlike many of his fellow expatriates, he was not old enough to be married nor have children. A lot of the families of the Chinese men who left China for other parts of the world, they left with the proviso that they have a wife and children, and that was to act almost as a anchor to pull them back to China. All right. The Hakka people, Hakka, is how it's spelled. They come from the region of China that is north central China. And through centuries of migration, largely initiated by the push of wars, they went farther and farther south and then east, so that most of the Hakka people in China are in Guangdong province, which is the southeasternmost region of China. If you looked on a map, it would be right next to Hong Kong. Hong Kong was once a part of Guangdong province, right? And then we come from slightly north, Fujian province. So all of this is a part of the Pearl River Delta. The Hakka people are a very prosperous people in China. And Hakka means guest, Guest. That's the nice way of translating Hakka. I think of it as invaders or interlopers, meaning that as they migrated more and more and more south and east, they were moving into lands that were already owned by somebody else. Those people in Chinese language, in Cantonese, were called Bunti, Punti, Bunti, local. So these are the local people, and then you have guest people, Hakka. As the Hakka people came and went into those lands, they traveled in packs, right? And so they would take over a land, and the men would marry and have families with the women who were already there. So not only are you taking the land, but you're taking our women too. The Hakka people are known for building these round houses, massive round houses, sometimes that can hold as many as 1,000 people. And they are called Tulou, Tulou. They are recognized, that they're pounded earth, right? And they're recognized in many like UN sustainable projects as like the most ecologically sound buildings that we have. So that's a little background which gives you some insight then as to why I'm going to give my thoughts on China and its global economy and what China is today. To set the stage, when the Chinese men overwhelmingly left China in order to fill in the absences created by the departure of enslaved Africans, not departure from the nations where they were taken to, kidnapped and taken to, but departure from the plantations. Many of the formerly enslaved Africans said, no, I'm not going to work for you. You just murdered, raped, maimed, beat me. Why would I, for a pittance, why would I come to work for you? So, no. So what you had then were, out of Asia, South and East Asia, there was poverty, there was famine, and so agents from these plantations would go to China and India and try to find workers. What you found when that occurred was that most of the places here in the Caribbean, in the Americas, South America, North America, where you found significant numbers of Chinese migration in order to work on these plantations, it would be people from one region occupying that entire workplace, meaning that in the same way that we're familiar with chain migration, right? So two men, maybe they're cousins, maybe they're brothers, they are convinced, they get on the ship, they come to wherever, Trinidad, Tobago, and they work. And they find that, okay, it's pretty good, right? And Guangdong province, by the way, the climate is very similar to the Caribbean, right? So they may send word back home, hey, it's pretty good. So more people, more men come. There were very few women because the employers did not want the extraneous problem of families. We don't care about families. Of children, we don't care about children. We just want the workers who are going to be in the fields doing the backbreaking work. The handful of Chinese women who came were usually brought for the sailors. They were sex workers, and many of them were kidnapped, right? So what we're seeing here is an imbalance in terms of the numbers, gender-wise, and so they'd arrive in these places, and human nature is human nature. There are women present, they're just not Chinese women, right? So when that happens and when that occurs, remembering that through much of the world for many, many years, even into modern society, men had the permission to have as many wives and families as they could afford. This was not new. It's not specific to Asia. It's not specific to Africa. It's not specific to what we call today the Middle East. It even happened in Europe. It was all over. Now, what this ended up doing was, particularly in a place like Jamaica, sometimes accommodations would be made. You have a wife here and you have a wife there, and they might know of each other and it's not even an issue. But there came a point, for example, in my grandfather's time, where his family said, this guy's not coming back to China, right? He's staying in Jamaica. He has children. He has local women partners. And so they sent a Han Chinese bride to marry my grandfather sight unseen when the immigration laws were lifted. When in the 1920s, right? By that time it was, well, yeah, sure, we can start to send some of the women. So you started to see some reconnecting of families, but some of those men never returned to China. And the practice really was, for those who had mixed race children, when those children, especially sons, if the father could afford it, he would send that child on a ship to China for the first time, accompanied by maybe one of his villagers, his countrymen, and they would take the child to the wife who was left behind, not her child, but her husband's child. And that child would be taught to be Chinese. By the time that child was 16, 17 years old or so, sent back to, say, Jamaica or Trinidad or Panama to take over the father's business and to work in the business. What you had then was a society, an economic society that was created that had, in a pyramid sense, huge swaths of Africans at the bottom. The buffer group would be comprised of Chinese, Indians, Syrians, right? And then at the tippy top would be the colonizer nation, whether it was Great Britain or Spain or Portugal, or France, look around the Caribbean, you can see, right? So now here we are. When those people left China, China as a society considers anybody who's not Chinese to not be worthy. So when those people left China, if they did return, they were not greeted as, welcome home. It was, how could you have left? So there was a certain amount of disdain towards people who had left China and then come back. Now, here in the United States, around the 1830s or so, we started hearing about gold in them there hills. And so what you had were certainly people in this country flocking to the West Coast, all right, I'll say California, and you had people from around the world hearing about it and flocking to the West Coast. There were not passports those days. There were not visas in those days. All you had to have was money for passage. And the Chinese heard about this. In fact, the translation for what this nation is called in China is Gold Mountain. So these people, these men, booked passage. They came, some from China, some from, now remember, China once included Japan, Korea, Thailand. All of this was once China. And through whatever the political maneuverings and the wars, they became independent nations. But China was once, from the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, all the way over to Japan. right? All of that was all China. Today, it's a bit smaller. I use the word a bit facetiously. It's smaller and it's cut up into a number of other independent nations. So here's what happens. Ultimately, these men have come to the United States seeking their fortunes. They don't speak the language. They don't even look like the people who have already landed here and staked claims. And so they were told they could not mine. No, not you. They got there, but they didn't have money for a return trip. That wasn't a part of the plan. Once we get here, we'll be rich. And so they languished. And as the miners, white men, came out of the mines on a daily basis, they found themselves hungry and dirty from being underground. Nobody around to cook, nobody around to clean. And so the Chinese men said, in exchange for a fee, we'll cook for you. In exchange for a fee, we'll do your laundry. I want to disavow anyone of the belief that there is a genetic disposition among people from China to be really good cooks or to be really good at laundry. That's actually not how it happened. What happened was those were the only two occupations they could have. And so most of these people came from Guangdong province, which I mentioned earlier. Most of them came from Guangdong province. The capital of Guangdong province we used to call Canton. Today we call it Guangzhou, right? Just as we used to call Beijing Peking, the Chinese have made certain that the world knows the names of these cities and these provinces as the Chinese call them. So they came from Guangdong province, which had the capital city of what was then called Canton. And therefore we have Cantonese style cooking. The ingredients were not present here in California. So what these men did, these Chinese men did, they went and found the produce and the meats and cooked them in a style that they thought would appeal to the tastes of these white men. So the foods here that a lot of us think are, oh, this is Chinese food. Well, this is actually not Chinese food. This is a bastardization of kind of like making do. There was certainly a style of cooking. The ingredients not the same, the seasonings not the same, the sauces not the same, and the palate of the people enjoying the food not the same. So what we eat here is not what we eat in China. No. Okay, so there. Beginning in the 1830s, as I said, they started coming. And then the next big event that I will talk about is the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad in the United States was being built from the east to the west and from the west to the east. And as we know, ultimately they met up in Utah, which is where the railroad was finally completed. Most of the construction of the railroad in the United States from the west to the east was done by these Chinese men who had come. The Chinese, while they invented dynamite, again, are not born with the knowledge of how to properly use dynamite. And so during the course of building the railroad, thousands of Chinese men died in accidents, explosions. They blasted through mountains, right? And when all was said and done, for a pittance, they actually were responsible for one of the biggest transportation systems that the world had ever known. When the railroad was completed, the United States had no use for them. Businesses had no use for them. So you found Chinese men in South Dakota, Utah, Missouri, wherever their work stopped, they stopped. Because in many instances, they didn't have enough money to go to wherever the next place was. Now, that continued for decades. In California, where I'm sitting in Los Angeles, in California, there were 200 plus villages and towns that were populated by Chinese. Today, fewer than 5 of them exist. It is the Chinese here in the state of California who actually planted the vineyards in the region that we know as Napa and Sonoma. In the Sacramento River Delta Valley, which is so known for its quality soil, 60% of the fruit produced in the United States comes from the state of California, and I think it's like 30% of the vegetables, something like that. But the land was made arable by the Chinese. Much of that land could not support crops. But the skills that the Chinese knew from back home, they came into China, into the United States, into California. Again, can't mine, so they got to find things to do, and they made that land arable. They were excluded, however, from becoming citizens. They could not own land. They had no access nor rights to public schools because of a series of laws that ultimately became known as the Chinese Exclusion Acts, right? So starting here in California, the racism towards Chinese was rampant, and it resulted in legislation that forbade, for the first time and the only time in the history of the United States, an entire nationality from becoming naturalized citizens. So the Chinese were not allowed to become citizens of the United States through the naturalization process until a particular event. So the Chinese Exclusion Acts began in 1882, nationwide. And then we're going to fast forward to an event called the bombing of Pearl Harbor. When Pearl Harbor was bombed, which for the United States was the signal that we needed to enter World War II, right? We needed to enter the war against Japan. When they bombed Pearl Harbor, remember that that was our outpost in the Pacific. It was a territory, it was not a state, Hawaii. And when they bombed, they destroyed our military, our naval military forces, so that almost nothing survived. Now, there has to be some type of retaliation, right? But without having an outpost in the Pacific, for planes to depart from the westernmost point in the United States, which would be the West Coast, let's say California, for planes to depart from California to fly all the way to Japan, to attack Japan, is a one-way suicide mission. What happened? The United States turned to China. We'd like to be allies. That is how China and the United States became allies in World War II. For the reason that the United States needed a place to land and refuel the bombers. Now, Japan had invaded and attacked China. My ancestral village, which is about 7 acres in Shenzhen, China, still has bullet holes in walls that are this thick. My ancestors, my elders, decided to leave the bullet holes so you could see. So there are bullet holes where the Japanese tried to enter our enclosed village. They couldn't get in. But they did, in fact, invade significant parts of China. Enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that is how United States and China became allies. Now, when we get to the point of the bombing of Japan, is when the President of the United States says, all right, well, with the end of the war, we gotta do something more to enhance our relationship with China, because after all, they helped us out. and that was the end of the Chinese Exclusion Acts. That is when the Chinese Exclusion Acts ended. So now, for the first time in the history of this nation, Chinese had access to public schools, owning property, voting. In fact, they didn't have those rights until really 1965, right? When another law was passed right after the law that as African Americans, that black people see as Voting Rights Act, and they had an Immigration Act that passed, and that's how and when those rights were furthered. But up until then, the Chinese families, men and women, have their children born in this country and buy property and put it in the child's name, the newborn child's name, because the newborn child born on this land is a citizen, but that child still doesn't have right and access to public schools. So now we're in a situation here where in the 1940s, after the war, the Chinese Exclusion Acts go away, and then that's supplanted by something called the Chinese immigration quota. Chinese immigration quota, right? Most nations did not have an immigration quota designated specifically to that nation. Might have been Western Europe, right? Might have been like that. Might have been Eastern Europe, but not a nation. So the Chinese immigration quota allowed for a total of 105 Chinese to be given visas to come to the United States annually. I could fit 105 people in my living room. The entire nation of China, 105 people. Now, go back and study the United States citizens, residents' attitude towards the Chinese, generally speaking. Yellow fever, there's all kinds of horrific, no dogs, no Chinese allowed, all of that. And it sort of, went hand in hand with how people of African descent, African Americans, black people were handled here. So what you saw in a lot of instances, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Louisiana, Chinese people came and opened groceries in neighborhoods where white people weren't going to do it. And they frequently would extend credit to the black sharecroppers and the black workers. And the Chinese couldn't live in the white communities, so they actually lived behind or above their shops, their stores. And throughout this nation, there is a history of Chinese people having a relationship with black people. That's not often talked about, but it is a long-standing history that has gone back from the 1840s, 1850s. Now, when we see the end of the Chinese Exclusion Acts, what we don't see is an end to the racism and prejudice towards the Chinese people, towards Chinese Americans. And remember that during World War II, we had a rounding up of Japanese, right? Born in this country, some were immigrants, but many, many born in this country, and they were incarcerated. They were put in concentration camps here in the United States, right? Sprinkled throughout much of the West, certainly in California, certainly in Oregon. They were sprinkled, and there are horrific stories and memories that people of Japanese descent can tell about how their families were treated, how their properties were taken away from them. They were rounded up and herded into locations against their will. Sometimes they had kind neighbors who would care for their properties if the property wasn't actually taken until they were released. But upon being released, it wasn't as though your entire community welcomed you home. You were still, in many instances, considered enemy. So the legacy of hatred against Asians goes all the way back to the 1800s in this country. I want to give one other philosophical difference between China and the United States, and then I want to talk about the modern part of what we're seeing today. Back when, and I believe it was Pope Alexander VI, Roman Catholic Church decided that the world was going to be divided in half, and one half would be given to Spain, and the other half would be given to Portugal, two Catholic nations, for exploration. At the time, the whole knowledge of spices was awakening people's palates, and oh my God, we have to have this. So an Italian, Christopher Columbus, was contracted by the Spanish to go to India and bring back some of the best spices and silks, all these things we've heard of. And Christopher Columbus assembled the 3 ships and the crews. We know what they are, you know, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And with the money supplied by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, he sailed out for India. And he got lost. He went the wrong way. So he ends up in what today we call the Caribbean, the island of Hispaniola, which one half of the island is Haiti, one half of the island is the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, a number of those islands in the Caribbean, and some along the way, the Greater Antilles, the Lesser Antilles. Christopher Columbus claimed them in the name of God and country, God being the Roman Catholic Church and country being Spain, planted flags, and eventually kept sailing until he hit Florida and what today we know as the United States. In the Caribbean, the name given to the people who inhabit that area, because Christopher Columbus stumbled onto the West Indies, those people were known as West Indian. And when he came and hit this body of land, it's called Indians. The indigenous people were called Indians. No, not Indians. But who's to argue with a white man from Europe representing King, Queen, and the Pope? All right, so there was another explorer from China who was sailing an armada of ships 3, 4, 5 times the size of a football field, individual ships, and his name was Zheng He, Z-H-E-N-G-H-E, Zheng He. And the difference in how these 2 explorers set out was Zheng He was sent out by the emperor of China to find interesting things to bring back. So they brought back animals, fruits, vegetables, things like that they'd never seen. But it was not to conquer lands nor people. Philosophically, it was, this is fascinating. We can't all go out into the world at large, so go out and find things and bring back some of them, not through wars, not through battle, but sometimes through trade. Modern globalism. In my experience as a child of the African diaspora and the Chinese diaspora, and I traveled to China quite a bit, people would ask me, yeah, but aren't you scared? And what is communism like? And I mean, how do they accept you as a black person? And I mean, you know, is it as modern as here being the United States? And I am fascinated by all of this, because the one thing that I can tell you that does not happen in these United States of America is an encouragement for people to visit China. No one is encouraged. They're not encouraged to visit China, right? And So, how do you feel as a child and a dual citizen of Jamaica and the United States when you see that China's going into Jamaica and, you know, and so taking over natural resources? And this is what I say, which is the same thing I say about what's happening in Africa with China. When you look at Africa from space, 10 years ago, much of the continent was not lit up. Hence, the dark continent. The people, dark, and the absence of electricity. So what you then have is a circumstance where people are living in an age and conditions that the rest of the world has progressed from, and so you end up with this moniker of being third world. In the past 10, 15, 20 years, China has negotiated with many of the nations, many of the 54 nations of Africa, that in exchange for you allowing us to develop your infrastructure, we'll build transportation systems, we'll build energy systems, we will build your infrastructure to a point that brings you into the 21st century. Let us, in exchange for that, develop your coastlines. We want to build hotels. We want to encourage tourism, right? And these nations, okay, some of them say, okay. We have people who would love to work on those projects, and China says, no, 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 no. We will bring our own people. Our people know our processes, they know the systems, they know the entire supply chain. We will do this. And that creates a lot of rancor and concern. Well, they're not giving us jobs, they're coming in. But China says, let us come in, we will do this, and we will leave. Some of our citizens want to stay. Why do some of them want to stay? They start their own businesses. Oh, they fall in love with some of the local women. Well, that's not new. We've seen this happen lots and lots of times in the past, right? And what they do is, in exchange for that, both sides end up with something, I guess, that they put on the board that's positive. I'm not here to advocate for the government of China. What I am here to say, however, is that for me, a mixed race person, Chinese grandfather, my 3 other grandparents are African Jamaican. The Chinese people did not enslave Africans. The Chinese people did not take their names away, their religions away, rape, murder, maim them, break up their families, and put them in inferior situations. That's not what's happening, right? But even to this day, there are parts of the world that are still operating under a colonial slave system. So when we look at China's attempt, global reach, superpower, I don't have the same kind of fear that I think many of us do have and are taught and encouraged to have, because we don't know China. What we know is what we're taught about China. Speaking of what we're taught, one of my majors in college was history, and I will share an anecdote. Years ago, my daughter, who today is almost 46, when she was 9 years old, we visited my African Jamaican uncle at his home in Florida, in Fort Lauderdale. And my daughter was always very smart and precocious, and my Uncle Harry asked her, Imani, how many continents are there? And Imani rattles them off, and I'm smiling. proud. And my uncle says, but I know what's coming because my uncle did this to me years ago. My uncle says to her, so what's the definition of a continent? And she says, oh, a body of land completely surrounded by water. And my uncle says, asks her, well, then Imani, name the continents. She's a little frustrated by this, like, okay, Uncle Harry, once again, and she rattles them off. My uncle, because he was that guy, has a global map in his den, and he says, come, point to the continents as you're saying them. And when she got to Europe, she froze. And he asked her, what's wrong? And she said, well, Europe is not a continent. And he said, but you told me it was. And she said, well, yeah, it's a continent. He said, well, how can it be a continent if, when you're looking at the map, it's not a body of land completely surrounded by water? My daughter's frustration went from Uncle Harry's making me tell him the same thing to, wait, what? What? You know, I'm the A+ student. I know what, and she, Ma, and I said, what are your eyes telling you? She said, Europe's not a continent. Right. Then why are they teaching me that Europe's a continent? Who's teaching you whose history? At which point I thought my daughter's head was going to explode. And I said, what you are experiencing is propaganda. Why would, even to this day, we be taught that Europe is a continent? Nobody says there are only 6 continents. It's still there are 7 continents. Oh, by the way, they stopped having Pluto be a planet, right? Oh, Pluto's not a planet, but Europe is still a continent. Why would that be? Why are we taught that China is a yellow peril? And yet, the largest population of international students at the top universities in the United States and England and Australia, France, let's keep naming Western nations. Up until COVID-19, the largest population was students from China. No financial aid, no scholarships, out of pocket. USC, $70,000 a year. Stanford, Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Princeton, you name it. Largest demographic. And it ended at USC when that gynecologist who had been raping and sexually molesting, he didn't rape, sexually molesting students for decades. When they did the analysis, the majority were Asian American and Asian females. Most of them were foreign students, international students, who didn't understand the gynecological examinations here. And he, no, it's fine, it's fine. And what happened when that word reached China, they shut it down. They shut it down. Parents stopped sending their daughters to USC. And for many years, USC had been number 1 in terms of the numbers. Why? Because in the state of California, we have the largest Asian American, Asian population in the United States, right? What I'm saying here is that, is it one way? Is it one way that China will send its students here, its children here, but we don't send our children to China because we've instilled a mistrust, a fear? It's a mysterious place, right? And I say that, you know, when my grandniece graduated from Vassar in 2016, we immediately sent her to China to live for like 5 months with our family in Shenzhen, because we're a family that's mixed race Chinese, right? I didn't discover and find any of the people in my family until the year 2012. And it's documented in a film, Finding Samuel Lowe, which was my grandfather's Western name. and a book, Finding Samuel Lowe, and a dear friend of mine, a Chinese Jamaican, Canadian now, Jeanette Kong was the producer and director of that. And I needed to have her help, right? She was such an important help because when I started trying to find my grandfather's family, I hadn't gone to China to look for them yet. I was just doing the research. But how do I present when I barge into this and say, oh, my grandfather's Chinese and I'm trying to, and people would be like, oh. Everybody was like, what, you're Chinese? Until I walked into the group of Chinese Jamaicans and they were like, oh, we'll help you, we'll know. Because they recognize, look past my hair, look past my skin color. They know what the range of mixed race Chinese can look like. Because some of them might be in their families, they certainly interacted with them and all of the above. So for this conversation that I was asked to initiate with the Chautauqua House, this for me is welcome. I have been on Chinese television. I was interviewed about my family, told the story of my family. CCTV, 30 million people watch this show, right? I presently have a contract with Amazon and Legendary Pictures to turn my book, which was published in the United States by HarperCollins. So this book is the story that I wrote about my grandfather, my mother, myself, that family history. And the United States, HarperCollins did not have a plan to publish in China. So I asked for the publishing rights and they gave them to me. And 2 editions, first edition, second edition, which the Ministry of Education in China has put on the reading list for high school and college. Why? Because I'm Chinese too. I'm not a citizen of China. China doesn't allow dual citizenship. However, if China did allow dual citizenship, all the people in the world, now we're talking global again, all the people in the world who by right of lineage could claim dual citizenship, there would be not 1.4 billion Chinese, there would probably be 2.4 billion Chinese in the world. When I tell this story in China, which I have done, when I've lectured there, what has happened is people, when I say, and you know they're translating for me, and when I say this, if dual citizenship were allowed, there would be 2.4 billion Chinese in the world. It's like immediate eruption and applause and screaming like, yeah, whatever the version of yay would be in China, right? And the joy in them understanding that it is the civilization of China that's out here in the world, right? The Chinese Exclusion Act was ended, right? But there were 2 exclusions to the Chinese Exclusion Act. One, you could in fact get a visa to come to the United States during that entire period if you were going to own a Chinese restaurant. The second exclusion was if you were going to own a Chinese laundry. I grew up in New York City. There was a time when probably on every 4th block there was a Chinese restaurant. And maybe every 7th or 8th block there was a Chinese laundry. How did that happen? It happened this way because the Chinese are a very strategic people. I get a visa, I'm going to own a Chinese restaurant. I come, I open the restaurant. 18 months later, I sell the restaurant to my cousin, my uncle, my brother, my father. Now he can get a visa. I don't have to leave the country, I'm already here. He buys that restaurant. Maybe I open another one. That's how the Chinese became known for China. There is no gene, right? Some of them were scientists. some were business people, some were scholars, but how do you get around this exclusion? Oh, so that's the loophole. Then we'll go through that loophole. That's one. Two, same story with the Chinese laundries. And why do we not see Chinese laundries in such abundance as we used to? Oh, the introduction of the home washing machine. That took a lot of the heavy work of laundering out of the hands of homemakers, right? Who and those who could afford would send their laundry out to the Chinese laundry. Now I can get a GE appliance, Hot Point appliance, and oh, there you go. My goal in this conversation is to deconstruct, demystify, bring some logic and truth to what we're seeing. How is it that we ping pong between, oh, we're friends with China, right? Nixon goes in 1960, oh my God, we're feeling better about it. And now we don't feel so good. And oh, we feel good again about China. No, we don't feel so good. And now where are we? Now where are we? When 45 was raging about Kung Flu and Wuhan, all of the above, I don't have an answer as to where COVID-19 came from. I may never have an answer. But what I can say is, had that started in Europe, England, France, Italy, had its Russia, because now I'm going to talk about the Germanic tribes and Donald Trump's familial connection to the tribes of Russia, right? Putin, they are Germanic people. So when we started to see across England, France, Italy, too many Chinese here, you started to see a very conservative eruption in governments in many of the Western powers. They were singing the same song as Trump. People were put in office because we're afraid that more Asians are coming, that more Africans are coming. We're seeing, we as the descendants of white Europeans, we're seeing that our numbers are going down because our people are not having as many babies. And these other people who are not white are having babies. So through birth and immigration, one group is becoming smaller and the other group is becoming bigger. Now it's about power and economy. I read the other day how the billionaires in the United States were not paying federal income tax. And still we have people in this country who aspire to be a billionaire and who don't bear a grudge because someday I can be a billionaire too, and I don't want to have to pay. Listen, you become a billionaire in this country by either being born into it or creating, inventing something that heretofore no one thought of, or figuring out a business model early enough, being the first one in, so that through your advantage and a monopoly created because you have that advantage and can capture the market early enough, you can become a billionaire. But you're not going to be born, on West whatever street and work every day. Hitting the lottery is not going to make you a billionaire. Even getting a PhD is not necessarily going to get... Many of the billionaires walk in this country right now dropped out of college. They didn't need it. They felt they didn't need it. Maybe they should have stayed because there would have been some humanitarian instruction, at least in my experience in liberal arts. I don't say liberal arts is the answer to everything, but maybe it would have given them more of a capacity to be humane, right? So what I'm getting at here is this may not be the kind of talk you expected, but if you wanted the perspective of the global reach of China from a child whose heritage includes China, firmly grounded here in the West. My parents were born in Jamaica. They migrated to New York City. I was born and raised in Harlem almost 69 years ago. And my view of the world has never quite lined up with much of what I was taught here, right? I was taught in some of the best schools in this country. I've been executive GE, ran the news department for the NBC in New York, ran TV stations for NBC Universal. My family owned the Los Angeles Sparks, the WNBA team, which I sold to Magic Johnson. We've had some movement, right? My brother created an algorithmic black box trading company, which 3 years after he founded it was capitalized at $500 million. We never saw ourselves as being stuck. We never saw ourselves as being limited by an artificial boundary that someone drew in reality and shows up on a map topographically that says that's a border. We grew up with family in Jamaica, England, China, Canada, Australia. We knew all that, we just didn't know how to find them. But eventually we did. And my goal, my hope is that the ensuing conversation that we're going to have opens up people's blinders, right? Do not limit yourself to thinking that it is just this. In my estimation, the best form of education is travel. If you can't travel in reality, then travel intellectually and virtually. But whatever you do, do not accept what you're being spoon-fed, as evidenced by how many continents are there? Go ask your kids that, and they're going to tell you exactly what you learned. And I'm telling you, it's a propaganda that does not have to continue. There's no advantage, but it's so cemented that even the teachers teaching it don't know, because they just accept what has been fed to them. So thank you.
I'm not sure how I would say wow in Chinese, but wow. That was a wonderful talk. I learned a lot, and that is my measure of any talk, if I learn a lot, and I certainly did from that. Now we turn to the always interesting part of the program, and that is the question and answer part of the program. Let me thank you again for spending the time with us. Let me thank our audience as well for tuning in. And so let me jump right to the Q&A. We have a little under a half an hour to do this, and I'll try and move as quickly as I can, and I will jump back and forth between the questions that come in on the platform and those that I have in advance. Let me talk a little bit about your quest to find your family, your Chinese relatives. Why were you so determined to do so? There are certainly lots of people who have done 23andMe, and they recognize their heritage, but they hardly go to the lengths that you have to find their relatives. What made you so determined to find them?
Oh, thank you, Errol, and thank you so much for having me. So I went to those lengths because growing up with my mother in New York, and my mother very, very much um, was so focused on our family, so bound and determined to make sure that we knew how important family was. But my mother didn't know where her family was. She said family is everything. But if family is everything, I wondered, then where is your family? Why don't we see them? Why don't we know them? And I concluded that my mom, who spent so much time being melancholy, right? I don't recall instances where my mother threw her head back and there was a throaty laughter of joy. That wasn't my experience. So as a small child, I concluded that my mom is depressed. Maybe that wasn't the word I knew, but I thought if I could find her family for her, I might be able to help her and make her happy. And that was truly what my motivation was. It was, let me unite my mother's family because she says family is everything. And I guess from the perspective of a dedicated daughter, right, this would be fulfilling my responsibility. I will hold this up. This is a picture of my mom. I don't know if you can see it well.
Yes.
But my mother had 3 children, Black, in Harlem. We were the only family in our neighborhood whose father did not live with them. So for us, there was an aloneness, there was a separateness. And I just thought that what my mother needed was her family. So I decided I would move heaven and earth, and I would find them. It was a pledge I made to myself when I was 6 years old. Strangely, when I was 21 and got my first taste of full-time employment, I decided that I would have to not work until I was 65. I learned 65 is retirement age. I can't work that long. I can't work for somebody that long. So I said, let me pick an age. So 7, which was my lucky number, 7 from 65 is 58. I'll retire when I'm 58. My grandfather probably won't be alive, but there will be family. I will find them and I will unite my mother with her family. And I don't know how or why, but I actually did retire at the age of 58. I actually did find my family at my age of 58, and by then my mom had already been gone for maybe 6 years. But my approach, my philosophy in life is that people may move to a different plane, but they never really leave. So people ask me sometimes, well, are you sad that your mother didn't get to be with her family? And I say, no, my mother is with her family. It's okay. She's actually still with me. So it doesn't always sound logical, maybe. Maybe it sounds more spiritual than anything, but I happen to, live in a world that is defined by many different cultures. So the uniting of my mother with her never met and long estranged family. She knew her father until she was 3 years old, but I was driven to accomplish that. And when it happened, I felt a sense of completeness.
Was there?
By the way, I can't see you. Is there a way that I can see your picture? I'm looking at the stage, which is odd.
Well, the stage is probably better looking than I. Let me say. We will try it.
There you are. I see you now.
Was there ever a moment in your quest when you felt that you might not accomplish your goal?
No. I never felt that way. No. I believed that it would just be a function of me starting. And so I retired. I took about 3 months to decompress. Not that I traveled or did anything. I just needed to come down from the going to work every day and ticking off the items on someone's agenda, right? The corporation's agenda. So I'll say I decompressed for about 3 months, and then I emailed my dad's side of the family, the African Jamaican family, to ask them, does anybody know how I can connect with the Chinese Jamaicans from whom my mother might be descended? And my Uncle Harry, the same one the continents, who was very well known in Fort Lauderdale because he owned an African bookstore, Ujamaa, and people there like, oh my God, Tony Harrison is your uncle? And I say, yeah, my father's brother. Oh, no wonder you're that way. So my Uncle Harry said to me, Paula, I've heard that most of the Chinese in Jamaica all come from the same region. So that gave me a hint. And from there, I contacted my dad's first cousin, African Jamaican, who lives in Toronto, Canada. And he said, there's lots of Chinese Jamaicans here. I'm gonna put you in touch, but let me make some inquiries first. And he told me there was a conference that happens every 4 years of Chinese Jamaicans in Toronto. He said, Paula, the conference is happening in a few months. Not a problem, I'm gonna sign up. So I registered my brothers and myself. We went to the conference, and the founder of the conference, named Dr. Keith Lowe. I met him and said, you are the first Chinese Jamaican I've ever met who has the same surname as my grandfather and my mother. Do you know them? No, I never heard from them. That was that. Done. I engaged a woman who I referred to in the lecture, Jeanette Kong. I hired her to produce whatever the documentary was that was going to come out of this search to find my family. She's Chinese Jamaican. She went to Dr. Keith Lowe, who was her neighbor, and said, we have to help them. Keith sent an email to his nephew in Hong Kong 2 weeks after the convention and that conference ended. He emailed his nephew in Hong Kong. There's a Chinese Jamaican woman. She just retired from NBC, blah, 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 looking for so-and-so. The very next day, an email came that I was copied on. And the response was, my uncle says Samuel Lowe is his father.
Ooh.
That day, through interaction, I learned that that gentleman was my mother's brother. So Keith Lowe was actually my cousin. We did not know that. And for me, it was always, I have to get off of my brain someone else's agenda, because from the moment I focus on this, I'm going to find them. So from the time we went to the Toronto Hakka conference, which by the way, is happening next weekend online. It's called TorontoHakkaConference.com. From the moment I finished at that conference, which only happened every 4 years, to the time I was sitting in China meeting my mother's brother and sister, that was from June 30th, and I was in China meeting my mother's brother and sister on August 16th. That's how, just like that, it happened. The help of knowing which community to turn to and using the powers and the connection of the internet. So me having been an investigative reporter and a history major and historian, and I majored in Africana studies also, all of these things came together to help me with the assistance of so many amazing people, but in no time I found them. But I knew I would.
I've got a question that I want to ask, and it is, were you ever concerned about the reception that you might get from your Chinese family once you found them?
I actually was not. I don't know if it was sort of this blind foolishness or just faith, but my husband, who is African American, from New Orleans, if you watched my documentary Finding Samuel Lowe, there's a point where I recount how I hadn't found them yet, and my husband said to me, Paula, when you find these Chinese people in your family, yes. He said, what do you expect? I had no idea what he was talking about. I said, what do you mean? He said, what do you expect? What do you think is going to happen? And I said, what are you asking me? I don't understand what you're asking me. He said, baby, do you know you're Black? And I was like, of course I know I'm Black. I'm not just Black, I'm Blackity Black. I know I'm Black. I said, they're my family, I'm their family, we're blood. All I expect is that we're going to be family. And my husband had this look on his face of, you poor, unfortunate dolt. You have no idea. I mean, he was in his mind, he was going, baby, I'm just trying to help you because you're setting yourself up for the biggest fall because these Chinese people ain't gonna. And I thought to myself, does he really think they're not going to accept me? I swallowed my words. He swallowed his words because you know, if you've been married for a long time, you know sometimes it's just some stuff you don't say, right? When my uncle learned through email, I detected some kind of, how do we know you are who you say you are? Mm-hmm. And all I could reply was, my mom was born on this particular date and year. She told me when she was almost 16 years old, she found her father's shop in Jamaica. And when she went into his shop, his older brother and his younger brother were actually there. He was not there. He had just left for China months before permanently, never to return. I had given the date and time, the date, right, of my mother's birth. My uncle, who I didn't know was my uncle, did the math. I said she was 15, almost 16. He did the math. He realized, okay, this should have been July 1933. My mother would have been 15, almost 16. His next response, which was translated to me, was, she's my niece. I want to meet her. That's how it happened. And I have no birth certificate. My mother has a birth certificate. My grandfather's name is not on it. But when I went to China and took the birth certificates that I'd gotten from the internet for all of my grandfather's children, all 8 of them, 5 of them fully Chinese, but all 8 of them born in Jamaica. I took copies of all of their birth certificates. They were stunned to see them because they grow up in China and they're actually born in Jamaica, which has to be hidden at that time. No one should know that. But with all of that, I took pictures of my mom. They brought pictures of my grandfather. And when I handed them my mother's pictures, my uncle said, she looks like him. So of all 8 of my grandfather's children, my mother is the only one who looked exactly like him. And they were like, wow, that was that.
Did they ever question your motivation? Did they question why were you doing this?
Well, they might have, but I said to my Uncle Jawu, who was the family patriarch at the time, I asked Uncle Jawu, again, family's translating, cousin is translating. I said, Uncle Jawu, did you look us up on Bing? Did you look me and my brothers up on Bing, which would have been Google or, their version of a search engine? And he smiled and said, yes. And I said, so you knew we weren't coming asking for money or an ownership in the village? He said, yes. And I said, I smiled. I said, I would have done the same thing.
What was the
So
most...
go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, finish, please. Your
Well,
tales are much better than questions.
no, I was just going to say, so I certainly don't want to suggest that people who are, that if you're not of a certain economic status, they won't want you. That's not what I'm suggesting. What I am suggesting, however, is that tradition in China is that the ancestral village that my ancestors are from, right, is about 7 acres in present-day Shenzhen, China. It's actually beautiful. The government of China has leased our village and turned it into the largest Hakka cultural museum in China. The entire village is the cultural museum. It's beautiful, right? Historically, if you leave your ancestral village and go to another country, you relinquish all claims. So there have, in fact, been people in my larger family who have come to China from England or Australia or Canada, wanting to know, well, do I get to own a part of the village because my grandfather was born here or my dad is from here? And the answer is no, you get none of it. So I wasn't looking for any of that. And that's probably more of where that would come from. Like, are you coming to try to establish a claim? I'm not trying to establish any claim. I got my own stuff. I'm good. I just want family.
This was a magnificent and long journey of discovery. If I ask you, what was the one singular most surprising thing to you in this journey, what would you say?
The singular most surprising thing was that when we entered our family village, and there is a gate, right, that you see them on television, the gates in China from the ground up, and you step over like a threshold that's about 12 to 15 inches high. Could be a little shorter, but you step into that. And over that, on this 30-foot wall, which is the wall surrounding my ancestral village, you step into that, but over the wall are 3 Chinese characters. And it's the family motto, which is family, prosperity, education. And when I learned that that was our family motto, I looked at my brothers and they looked at me and we were like, that's crazy. Because growing up in Harlem with our mother, as I mentioned earlier, it was all about family, right? It was all about education. Now, my mother only went as far as second form in the British system, which would have gotten her to maybe 7th grade. My dad completed technical school and so forth, but my father and my mother both insisted that we get superb educations. My brother went to Harvard Business School. I went to Vassar. Somebody congratulated my father years ago on my brother's getting an MBA from Harvard. My father was like, that's what I came to this country for. So we got no pats on the back for that, right? It was expected. But I bring that up because family, education, and then my mother said over and over to us when we were children, I came to this country not intending to get married and not intending to have children, but I married your father, I have children, and you, by God, are going to be wealthy. And we were like, okay. And she said, if the Carnegies can do it and the Rockefellers can do it, then by God, you're going to do it. Now, my mother had no concept of what it takes, but she figured, well, if they can do it, of course you can do it. And we had no other family around us to say to us, your mother's blowing smoke, right? So what she told us was what we believed. So we were driven by our mother to pool our money, which we did, invest in real estate, which we did, get great educations, which we did. My father said to me, my father was a union shop steward for the United Auto Workers. He worked in an airplane engine manufacturing plant on Long Island in New York. And my dad said to me one day, I will be so ashamed if you retire from a company and they give you a gold watch. And I was like, well, I thought that that's what people wanted. My father said, you buy your own damn gold watch. You're not going to keep working for some man all those years and all you get out of it is a pension and a gold watch. You have to save your money and you have to have your own businesses. Now, in our vernacular, we call that a side hustle. I have given lectures on how to turn your corporate job into a side hustle. Because what you do not want to do, and I, to this day, know top executives of some of the biggest companies in this country who never thought about going out on their own and creating their own. The goal is to reach a high enough level in a corporation and then retire. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but my family is Jamaican. The stereotype about Jamaicans and us having 50 jobs is not too far from the truth. The idea being multiple income streams. Do not rely on someone to give you a paycheck. So for me, family, education, prosperity, it was like, oh my God, my Low family in China believes in the same thing, and they really do. So that was surprising.
I got time for one more question here. This has been an amazing story, not only of family, but also of geopolitics, and also, as we know, of the challenges of people of color of living in America. When we listen to you, it's all about a lot of different cultures, about Jamaica, about Africa, about African Americans, about Chinese. And all of the people in these cultures often struggle with getting a sense of self and a sense of self-worth. And so my last question is, how has finding your Chinese family influence your own sense of self? And what has changed for you after finding your family?
Well, the only thing that's really changed is that I now have a much bigger family. My sense of self was always firm. I never wavered. Look, I recognize that I am blessed. My family, my parents broke up when I was a toddler. And my brothers and I grew up on welfare in Harlem with our mother, right? That sense of self that I have came from being the daughter of a single mother who was struggling and who all the while never lost sight of ensuring that we have a place in the world. It's my belief, Errol, for however wrong it may be, but it's my belief that a sense of self wavers when you don't have the support of your people and your community or your communities to support that sense of self. So never in my life did I ever believe that somebody was going to tear me down. I have argued from grammar school with teachers as they tried to assess me as something or not, because I refuse to let somebody else impose, I'll call it, their racist perceptions of who I am and who I get to be. I do want to say, just to make sure we're clear about this, is that I did have a little girl who I was jumping rope with when I would double dutch when I was 8 years old. She was from a couple of blocks away. Black girl, we're all black, we're hanging out, jumping double dutch. My mother came outside and everything in my neighborhood was usually pretty okay. But if my mother came outside, it was like a ripple in the universe. Like people would be like, who is that? What is going on? What is that Chinese woman doing here? Right? So my mother came outside and she called me to come in for lunch. And as I said, okay, Mom, I'm coming. This little girl from a couple of blocks away didn't know us like that. And she said, who's that? And I said, that's my mom. She said, that's not your mother. So I could feel the anger welling because you're now denying me my mother. This is even at the age of 8. And I said, that's my mother. And then she said that, and it starts with CH and ends with a K, and it's a pejorative for Chinese people. She said, that is not your mother. So I punched her in the face, knocked her down, and stood over her. I straddled her and told her, get up, because I'm going to beat the crap out of you. She didn't get up. My mother was standing on the stoop watching this, arms folded, looking at us. And when I walked over to my mother, she said, what happened? I said, she called you a... So I punched her. And my mother said, okay, good, come inside and eat. Now, I'm telling you that my brothers and I, as many people do, we got it from all directions. But I am firmly African American. I know I am Black. I have to tell you that I'm Chinese because it doesn't present. But I don't go around saying to people, no, I'm not really Black. I'm also Chinese. I don't do that. So my sense of self is firmly grounded in what it is. And I've had Chinese elders say to me, oh, we're so proud of you, so proud of you. You're so successful. That's the Chinese. And I will say, that's racist. You don't get to tell me that the success is Chinese because it suggests that the failure would be African, and I reject that. I know you think you're complimenting me, but you're not. So, Errol, I want to sum this up by saying you have to stand in your truth, and you have to be willing to stand and speak your truth to whomever it is you're in front of. It doesn't matter, right? So that's that strong sense of who I am. I've always had this. It has not wavered. It's not new. The only difference between now and then is that I have a much bigger family and that I get invited to Chinese things, where in the past, I really wasn't. That's it.
This has been wonderful. I could go on for hours. Unfortunately, they will not let me. Let me thank you again for sharing your family, sharing your excellent grasp of history and geopolitics with us. I hope that you will come and visit Chautauqua. It is now open for business. I had one statement from one of your friends on the grounds here, Roz Stark, who knew you from in a past life from the LA Times, who is anxious to have you here. And I'm sure all of us are now anxious to have you here to talk with you in a place where intelligent discourse can take place.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming, the audience. Thank you and the audience for looking, and thank our supporters for making this wonderful talk possible. We'll see you next week.
CHQ Assembly is made possible through the collaboration and innovation of Chautauqua Institution's full-time and part-time staff, seasonal staff, and many volunteers, as well as participants like you, whose engagement, gifts, and subscriptions sustain our mission.